I've been obsessed with this question for many years. It's driven a lot of my reading decisions, and I've put in heavy research. It's been a labor of love, but heavy research. There's 40 Reddit threads on this topic, one way or the other, different phrasings, but around 40 threads. There's 6 other YouTube videos, and there's around six blog posts that I know of. I've demolished all those contents. I even created a spreadsheet where all the recommended books, I kind of put them in categories and went from there. And this is over many years. And I've tried a lot of the books, and I think I have a curated list that there's someone for everyone here. And we're going to do something a little different. Usually I do top 5 or top 3 videos, but I think in this one I'm going to go back and forth. There'll be about 10 books. I'm going to go back and forth with one that's either, think of it as a overrated, underrated, even though it's not exactly like that. One is going to be the kind of like the typically recommended book. And then I'm going to give my recommendation with something that's either more accurate or something that I like better. And I'm going to try to keep it within the similar style of the first book. So it'll be in the same vein, and we'll just go from there. Think of it as overrated, underrated, but it's not quite like that. It's more typical versus maybe if you go a little deeper like I have. And the good part about this is it's a win-win situation. Even the first ones that I mentioned are still valid and still great options. I just went a little bit deeper and found something more to my liking. So let's before we jump into it, let me just say that, like I said, I've worked on this question, this idea of a book similar to Legend of Zelda for, I would say, around 10 years. Almost pathologically, but it's been fun. I've gotten into it so much that I ended up writing my own book, but we'll get to that. But I think I'll do a quick primer on what it actually means to be similar to The Legend of Zelda. I mean, all the games are somewhat different, so you can't, base it exactly on one game, but it's the essence that we're talking about. It's whimsical, it's cozy, but most of all, it's fun. I put big consideration on novels that can be read by younger readers and adults because the games can be played by kids and adults. You get extra points if, there's a hero and a princess and they're, working off each other in some way. You get extra points there. And of course, there has to be sword fighting. Sword and shield has to be incorporated. That's like a major part of the games. Each game cover pretty much has a sword, and a shield. So with that said, let's jump into it. The most recommended book probably is The Hobbit, and I can understand why. It's one of the. It's probably the most recommended fantasy book just in general. It's the quintessential adventure quest book. Starts the Lord of the Rings series. And is it a valid answer to this question? I would say yes. But if you want to go a little bit deeper, a little bit more accurate, I would go with, and if, within the same vein of the writing style and the same, overall concept, I would go with the Book of Three, The Chronicles of Prydain. I think that, and there was a Disney movie that didn't do too well based on it called The Black Cauldron, but this book had more of that, just hit it on the nose a little bit better for me. A farm boy, then he goes on adventures. The land seemed very Zelda-like. The path seemed Zelda-like. It was, very cozy, but still, has some solid sword and sorcery involved. And some humor. So, I would try the Chronicles of Prydain, Book of Three, over The Hobbit. Second one that is very highly recommended is Earthsea. This is the Earthsea cycle. And I can see why. I mean, it's especially compared to Wind Waker. He travels throughout the different islands, and even the second and third book in the series gets even more Zelda-like. And if you're up for, if The Hobbit and the Book of Three are more on the cozy side, this maybe gets a little bit more challenging in some ways, even though it's technically a children's book, I guess. It gets a little bit more ethereal, like maybe more philosophical, and I can see it's a valid answer. But to me, if you want to go a little bit deeper in the same type of ethereal, whimsical, poetic writing style, I would go with The Tower at Stony Wood. Um, I read one of her other books, which was also recommended more, which is The Riddle Master of Head, and it didn't really, do it for me exactly. But that was it was the right idea, but the wrong answer. The correct answer with this author is The Tower at Stony Wood. It's just, there's a knight that goes off, basically to save a princess, save a queen, and he kind of attacks different towers, and you can almost think of the towers as temples in the Legend of Zelda. So it has that uh, aspect to it, and it just felt more like Zelda compared to Earthsea. So if you want to try something a little bit deeper than Earthsea, go with The Tower at Stony Wood. And then now we'll shift into something maybe a little bit more young adult, kid oriented. The number one recommended book in that space is probably Redwall. And it makes sense. Matthias is kind of like the reborn Martin the hero, just like Link is, in a lot of the games, the reborn hero. You got Clooney the Scourge, who's kind of like Ganon, a very typical like evil character. And it even the cover, it's a mouse, but if you just replace it with a young boy, it looks like a Zelda cover. And and also if I'm giving the second book as my recommendation, it's also something maybe that I enjoyed more or just liked more. So there's no rules to this. It's just a general idea. But in terms of the young adult space, I would prefer Alana, the First Adventure, Song of the Lioness over Redwall, surprisingly. It's a female, I mean, especially if you're interested in a female main character. It hit it a little bit better for me. Like there was just the right amount of magic. It was refreshing to see it from a female's perspective. It's a female who wants to be a knight. She switches places with her brother. They go their separate ways. And there's also, then there's, instead of a princess involved, there's a kind of like a prince. So it has a good juxtaposition there. And it just hit it, and, there's good sword, the sword elements involved, and just enough magic. So instead of the typical Redwall, maybe try Alana, the First Adventure. So I just liked it overall better as a personal taste. Second, we'll get more into like, modern, moving forward, we'll get more into the modern classic fantasy, in the whole, the recent wave of novels. And in the past 40 years, let's say. And you have a lot of people recommending The Sword of Truth, the Wizard's First Rule. And I can see the comparisons are valid with this book as well. Paul, the main character, kind of becomes somewhat of a loner in some way. And first of all, I didn't finish this novel. I'll just be honest. It was a DNF for me. But you can see Paul being somewhat Link-like in his, on his own loner aspect. And then, there's a definite, I don't remember her name, but she kind of reminded me of Moraine from The Wheel of Time. She gets into the novel pretty quickly and, kind of like Princess Zelda in a way. But if you want something a little bit more accurate in the same vein, I would go with The Sword of Shannara instead. I think that had like a little bit more of the cozy feel. Shay, blonde-haired, hero kind of was more apt for Link compared to The Sword of Truth. So I just think, with Terry Brooks, I just think he, like it was just more approachable, more contained, maybe just the right amount of magic. And the Warlock Lord, like I guess, the Ganon, just seemed more like a video game villain. So overall, the villain in Sword of Truth was maybe a little harsh. So I just think as a better recommendation is maybe not quite as even though it's well known. I think the Sword of Truth maybe definitely has almost more than double the reviews than Sword of Shannara. So I would, uh, if you want to go a little bit deeper, go with Terry Brooks in that space. Next, we'll move into something, and I'm trying my best here to keep the two books somewhat similar in neither time frame or style, but I have another DNF for me that is a popular recommendation for that a lot of people chime in with, Pawn of Prophecy, the Belgariad. Uh, the main character, very Link-like, chosen one. You see him at different ages, which works well, for some of the Zelda games. There's collecting of an orb, which is, very, Zelda-like. But to me, I just flat out enjoyed the Dragon Bone chair more. Kind of, it just was a little bit more like endearing to me. I liked Simon better. And, just kind of like down on his luck, Castle Scullion and gets, thrust in the adventure. The princess in the Dragon Bone chair, Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, is pretty similar to Princess Zelda in a lot of ways. So it just seemed like, if you want to, go with that like epic fantasy space, the Dragon Bone chair just hits it, a little bit more on the nose, for me in terms of a novel that's similar to The Legend of Zelda. And finally, we get to, so all of these books so far have practically, I think Sword of Truth and Dragon Bone chair came after the first Legend of Zelda for Nintendo. But all of these books have been before the Legend of Zelda game even existed. So, we try our best to, say books that are similar in vibe, in style. But in this last section, we'll get to books that are a little bit, that are two books or two, sets that are modern and that are actually inspired by the game, the actual game. So I would say this is the most recommended book out of anyone who chimes into the Reddit threads and YouTube videos. How to Defeat a Demon King in 10 Easy Steps, Andrew Rowe. But you could really just put Andrew Rowe as the answer here, because all of his, I think he was a video game designer before he started writing, or in tandem with when he started writing. And How to Defeat a Demon King is the most, recommended book of his. But in my mind, I think I would, within his work, I would probably go with 6 Sacred Swords. You also have the Arcane Ascension, Sufficiently Advanced Magic, and you also have Edge of the Woods, which, can be arguably also similar to Zelda. But I think the 6 Sacred Swords, even according to him, is the most true Zelda-like. Even though How to Defeat a Demon King is probably most inspired by Zelda, it is a parody, and the feel isn't quite there. So with Andrew Rowe, I mean, it's great, but the similarity to me is more mechanical. It's more mechanical. The true essence of the feel of The Legend of Zelda isn't quite there. And it's not a criticism, it's more just my, opinion. For example, when you hear the music in The Legend of Zelda, that feeling, you get that feeling. I would say maybe no to that. But another modern book, and maybe you'll forgive some self-promo, is my book, The Myth of Aldez. Now it's in a couple of reviews, some of the readers said, for fans of The Legend of Zelda and How to Defeat a Demon King. So it's in that same genre per se, modern genre. And it's a book that I wrote, I put a lot of emphasis on, the problem-solving plot progression, which is like what Zelda truly is to me. It's, figuring out how to move forward in the game. And that's what I try to implement into my fantasy novel. So if you want something a little bit closer to The Legend of Zelda compared to Andrew Rowe, even though he's pretty darn close, give my indie fantasy novel a try. And with that said, this I have a couple. I can do a couple other videos on this topic. I can do basically like a top 5 or a top 10 indie self-published Zelda-like novels, because if you really want a novel or a fantasy novel that's similar to very similar to The Legend of Zelda, you kind of have to go in the indie space, because we just have more freedom there, and it's just more accurate. The traditionally published, I know How to Defeat a Demon King was published with Saga Press, so I think that's his, that started his traditional publishing. I could be wrong. Before that, Andrew Rowe was self-published. But, the traditional publishers, they have to play it safe at times, or, we're talking about a lot of the traditionally published vintage books, which were the first 8 books discussed in this countdown. But if you want it specific, I can go, top 5, top 10 indie books. You can also go, I could also, do another video on books similar to each game. So however many games that, you take like the 10, most popular Zelda games, and you can do books similar to those. So for example, a lot of people, the most requested individual book is Breath of the Wild. Without getting too much into it, the Psalm of the Wild built would probably be the answer to that. It's hands down the most recommended. So I could do another video, or you could think of it as, finding books that are similar to actual games. And then the third video I could do is children's books. So I kind of kept it, ages 10 and up for this list, but you can go even younger, and there's a lot of books similar to Zelda. I mean, the Del Toro series you could throw in there. So, and there's several others. So, if you feel like it, in the comments section, see, what others kind of video on this topic, indie books, books per game, or children's books might be a good fit. So this video was a long time in the making. I just, let it riff. And, like I said, it's been a passion of mine for a long time. Hopefully it was interesting going back and forth between a popular book or a popular versus less popular, or whatever the reason I went back and forth was. But there you have it. And have a great, thanks for stopping by. Hope to see you back.